Technocracy News. I can't recommend your books and website enough. I want to remind everybody we're live streaming on many forums, and several of them have chats. We're at Rumble on Technocracy News, Worldview Tube, and CHD TV. We're live streaming on Solari too, but the first three have chats, and we are watching the questions. Make sure to post your question in the chats, and we will use those questions for the panel that we have with all the presenters today as our last session. So let's turn now to the next presentation. OmniWar, if that at the core of OmniWar is the battle for our minds and our hearts and minds both. The question then is, who's doing this? And in an invisible war, it's so hard to see who's pulling the strings. If there's an invading army, you know who's invading. But if the invasion is coming in invisible ways and invisible forms, it's still really important to see who is doing this. So let's turn to our next presenter who's done extraordinary work for many years in understanding the fine nuts and bolts of who's doing this and how it integrates into the invisible war for our hearts and minds around us. So Logan, if I could turn to you to introduce Lissa Johnson and our next presentation.
Yes, our next presenter will be Lissa Johnson. She has an undergraduate degrees in media studies and in behavioral science with an honors thesis in neuroimmunology and an MA in the clinical psychology and a PhD on the psychological processes involved in manipulating reality perception. And she will be presenting on transhumanism and COVID-19, military operations in civilian disguise. Here it is.
So the title of my presentation today is Transhumanism and COVID-19, Military Operations in Civilian Disguise. And I'll be posing one proposition and one question. And my proposition is that transhumanism is a military intelligence operation which is long-standing and quasi-clandestine in that it hides in plain sight with a 2020 to 2050 timeframe for implementation. And my question is whether COVID-19 can be understood, at least partly, as a supporting psychological operation for transhumanism specifically, which is likely to evoke two very different reactions from, "That's insane, are you mad?" to, "Well, of course they are, that's obvious," with a spectrum in between. And in fact, just a few short years ago, I was towards the left-hand end of this spectrum. It was only the shock of COVID-19 that sent me on a journey to try and understand what was going on, unexpectedly leading me to technocracy and transhumanism, the evil twins that Patrick has written about in his recent book. So I know firsthand that this material can be very difficult to engage with. It is truly bizarre if it's new to you and almost impossible to believe. But I also know, having engaged with the evidence and taken it seriously, that it's equally impossible to believe that others won't, because it's such a serious matter. All of which only makes it more difficult for people at either end of this spectrum to talk to one another, particularly on the back of the divide and conquer tactics and war on dissent of the COVID era, which has left even people in the same households often inhabiting vastly different realities, with dialogue as one of the many casualties. But my aim today is not so much to bring people up the left-hand end of this spectrum around, and I don't mean political left and right there, because I know that facts and evidence alone are unlikely to reach anyone with strong pre-existing views. Instead, my aim is to help people up the left-hand end see that those up the right-hand end are not insane. They're not crazy. They have good reason to think as they do. And I hope to help people up the right-hand end with some new ideas or information that might enable them to speak with a bit more confidence about this material, knowing that they're on solid ground. But it can still be very difficult because the nature of this subject matter is such that it is just psychologically invisible to many people. And one reason for that, not the only reason, but an important one, is that cognition is motivated. So as much as we feel that we're rational and logical, our decision-making, our beliefs, our reality perception are powerfully and unconsciously influenced by emotion and motivation. When you look at cognition by the millisecond, for instance, emotion enters the decision stream first, and the cognition that follows typically rationalizes and supports the emotional state. So if you're fearful, for instance, fearful beliefs and thoughts typically follow, along with decision making that helps you to feel safe, in line with your survival motive. All in milliseconds, before we're even aware that we've mustered a conscious thought, which has led researchers in the field to say that cognition is in the wake behind the boat. And so it is with transhumanism. Bizarre, improbable material elicits feelings of suspicion, and suspicious cognition follows, along with decision making that helps you to feel safe from the suspicious content, which is to reject it as fantasy, nonsense, irrelevant, insane. On top of which, manipulating reality perception can be as easy as manipulating emotion and motivation. So make it difficult to engage with transhumanism in the COVID context, for instance, by public shaming of those who do, and cognition of onlookers will be sent fleeing in the opposite direction. So does this mean that we can never be rational or dispassionate? Well, no, it doesn't. There is one motive and an accompanying psychological state that fosters resistance to these emotional and motivational pressures. And that motive is accuracy, which sounds boring, but it refers to accurate understanding, true, genuine understanding, that motive. And the psychological state that supports it, not surprisingly, is curiosity. Not idle curiosity, not morbid curiosity, but a particular kind of curiosity, known as science curiosity, named after true science, as opposed to the inverted science of the COVID era. And like true science, science curiosity is humble and it's flexible. It's constantly re-evaluating what it thinks it knows and always on the lookout for new information with a willingness to entertain material that runs counter to pre-existing views. And if it's strong enough, it can override the other emotional and motivational pressures on cognition. So if you'd like to chart your own path through the information warfare landscape, nurture your curiosity. Which brings us to transhumanism as a military operation. And today will be the sliver of the tip of a very large iceberg of supporting material, which Dan and David and I have summarized in a 4-part article series on the subject. So you can delve into that if you would like to read about anything further, and I'll make these slides available after the symposium with references and links. So what is transhumanism? Well, the trouble with answering that question is that definition has been monopolized by transhumanism's proponents, who have laced their definitions with self-flattering evaluative terms, such as this one from the Transhumanist Manifesto. A worldview that seeks a quality of life that brings about perpetual progress, self-transformation, practical optimism, visionary solutions, and critical thinking, the transhuman. The transhuman is a biological technological organism, a transformation of the human species that continues to evolve with technology. And I could read definition after definition in the same vein, which essentially turns definition into a propaganda device by repeatedly pairing transhumanism with concepts such as enhancement, transcendence, progress. Those defining terms function as subliminal cue words, or what's known as affective tags, with the power to psychologically subdue and pacify via unconscious emotional associations. So the implication for transhumanism is that threat-related emotions are suppressed, such as vigilance and caution, and emotions associated with benign to benevolent material are evoked. But the unasked question throughout is what constitutes enhancement? Lethality, for instance, is taken as enhancement in the military intelligence domain, and academic transhumanists have advocated for what they call anti-love biotechnology. So anti-love biotechnology concerns what its authors describe as an urgent ethical project to find a cure for love, their words, ideally using an anti-love vaccine, I kid you not, and/or an array of pills, biochips, and neuroceuticals that could treat problematic passions and foster well-suited relationship bonds. And not to forget the dark history of the term enhancement. Sexually assaulting victims with medical equipment, for instance, was considered enhanced interrogation in the War on Terror. Enhanced suffering, enhanced misery, enhanced brutality. Which really speaks to the power of language. None of the architects of this program were held to any serious account, so it's not just about sugarcoating with words. It's about incitement, of indifference, and therefore passive bystanding, which is the social bedrock of atrocity. So should harmful agendas, such as lethality or the deadening of love, systematically attach themselves to notions of enhancement, then the term transhumanism becomes a morally disengaging tool, or a tool to incite indifference, sanitizing atrocity under the rubric of advancement, transcendence, etc. So beware of your own indifference. For instance, just below the transhumanist concept of human enhancement is human extinction. So here's Yuval Noah Harari, historian of the future and prominent pundit on the world stage. Fast forward to the early 21st century, and we just don't need the vast majority of the population. If you're not part of the revolution fast enough, then you'll probably become extinct. And Hans Moravec, leading transhumanist roboticist, also argued that biological humans would eventually be rendered extinct, from that notorious conspiracist site, Encyclopaedia Britannica. Look a little closer, and you find yourself in the realms of post-humanism, with transhumanism as a step along the way. So Max More, a leading transhumanist philosopher from the 1980s, said that transhumanism is merely a transition stage to posthumanism. And Nick Bostrom, a contemporary leading transhumanist philosopher associated with Oxford University, has said that transhumans will evolve into a, quote, enhanced post-human species that transcends or supplants humanity. And once again, I could read quote after quote in the same vein. But of course, post means after, which makes humans a thing of the past. So if we begin to understand transhumanism, not as enhancement in the humane sense of the word, but as a project towards a post-human state, it's not a stretch to begin seeing transhumanism as a war on humanity. So in our transhumanism series, we've offered a definition of transhumanism that's cleansed of dogma and positive spin. And that is a project to engineer human biology by technological means on a mass scale. So in terms of the military intelligence project to engineer human biology, I'll be going through primary source material in 3 categories and organising the material in terms of common yes but responses, which you're very likely to encounter if you try to talk about this material. So first is transhumanist futures or strategic vision documents at NASA. So NASA is important to transhumanism's history because shortly after Julian Huxley proposed the term, reportedly to rebadge eugenics following World War II, NASA reported on what it called its cyborg program, which was about engineering man for space, purportedly to improve astronauts' longevity on space flights. and it sought to obtain the maximum integration of man into a man-machine complex. But over the years, NASA experienced some mission creep. By 2001, the NASA Langley chief scientist was speaking at a national security conference about NASA's futures work with over 30 other agencies. And he said that exploding technological revolutions in IT and bio and nanotechnologies at the time were driving humanity towards not just revolutions in warfare, but a new era for humanity, which was set to commence in 2020. And the technological explosions driving that trajectory towards the new bio-nano era included genetic engineering, and prior to birth, implantable electronics, including for brain monitoring and stimulation, nanobots, smart dust, biocomputing, artificial life, and more. And as futuristic as those technologies sound, and no doubt sounded in 2001, he made the point that such technologies remain in inventory for over 40 years and were no pixie dust at the time, which is consistent with historian of science Peter Gallison from Harvard University, who says that classified scientific research is 5 to 10 times larger than what we see in the open literatures, such that we civilians have our backs to what he calls a vast and classified empire we barely know. And in keeping with that stealth mode, NASA said that the technologies underpinning the bio-nano era would be deployed under Trojan horse civilian systems, with civilian in quotes, as in wink wink. And one of the slides laid out NASA's technological ages of humankind, going back to the hunter-gatherer age. And a number of things about this and the entire presentation really stood out as uncannily prescient about what ultimately took place in the COVID era, not least of which was the date, of course, 2020, along with its foundation in societal disruption as opposed to natural resources or farmlands, which arrived right on time in 2020 to enable the worldwide, unprecedented, state-led, mandated bio-nano, quote, enhancement of the human immune system, along with tele-everything, which the slides foresaw, telemedicine, tele-education, tele-shopping, and weaponized viruses, along with psychological warfare. And another thing that stood out was that the slides declared that the bio-nano era would see the surreptitious nanotagging with microwave interrogation, which means wireless monitoring, of everything and everyone for identification and status purposes, which is quite a remarkable proposition. Surreptitious nanotagging of everyone, presumably populations. So a curious mind has to ask, what status? Whose info? Why? And then in the real 2020, just a month or so after the declaration of a pandemic, Yuval Noah Harari said that COVID-19 was the moment that surveillance went under the skin. And he said that a number of times, which he described as perhaps the most important development of the 21st century. And the obvious question here is, what on earth was he talking about? Then, by 2011, NASA experienced more mission creep. In a technology intelligence database on hundreds of technologies of interest to multi-government activities, NASA described simulated reality that is indistinguishable from real experiences. It works directly on the brain itself through simulated input on the level of individual neurons. It aims to be so completely immersive that the user would be unaware that he or she was using a simulated reality interface. In other words, hijacking and controlling a person's reality perception, potentially without their knowledge. And the obvious question there is what legitimate business do governments have with technology like that? Then, in 2015, the NASA Langley chief scientist talked about a future of human-contaminated machines. And in 2020, he said the major question that all of this raises is whither humans? Getting back to that extinctionist, post-human theme. Well, yes, but those are just NASA futures. Of course they're space age. That's all sci-fi pie in the sky. Except that transhumanism is DoD-wide. And the DoD took a decisive turn towards it with the turn of the millennium, starting with 3 key initiatives that dovetailed and coincided, and which are, to my mind, among the most underreported series of developments in national security affairs. And one of those was the 2000 DoD Defence Science and Technology Strategy, which declared that the DoD for the 21st century would be leveraging the technology explosion, the same technology explosion that NASA talked about the following year, including combining biology with electronics in order to make DoD forces lighter and more lethal. And in fact, the following year, NASA Langley referenced lethality as a rationale for the bio-nano era. At the same time, at the White House, there was a thing called the National Nanotechnology Initiative, which would lead to the next industrial revolution. And where have we heard that term before? The next industrial revolution, the 4th industrial revolution. Well, Klaus Schwab, of course, was talking about it repeatedly in the COVID context, saying that it would see the merger of our physical, our digital, and our biological identities. And in 2020, he said that COVID-19 had made the 4th industrial revolution a reality. Well, the White House was using the same language in the year 2000, which does include the DoD, because although on the face of it this looks like a civilian science endeavour, participating agencies included the DoD and NASA. So why is a nanotechnology initiative so important to transhumanism? For a number of reasons, and a key one is that nanotechnology is critical to the goal of engineering biology. And one reason for that is that it enables the controlled atom by atom and molecule by molecule assembly of novel synthetic structures, as well as novel synthetic and biological combinations. But it's worth pointing out that the nanotechnology revolution doesn't date to the turn of the millennium. It goes back to the 1950s. And in fact, an Air Force paper makes clear that the US and the military had been focused on it for decades by 2000. So the significance of the year 2000 is more that that's when the upper echelons of power began explicitly declaring their goal to leverage nanotechnology in order to engineer human biology. And the third initiative were two seminal workshops and reports that led to an initiative called the Nanobio Info Cogno, or NBIC initiative, a very influential initiative that, for instance, led to the Graphene Flagship Program, which is Europe's largest ever research initiative. And so the NBIC project went a little bit beyond the National Nanotechnology Initiative in that it was focused on not just nanotechnology, but combining that with biology, and specifically human biology and brains, and combining all of that with IT and AI. And like Klaus Schwab and the White House and the DoD, the National Science and Technology Council described this as a revolution, and one that would change society, giving the example of wired humans, which it said would be wired fully, not only internally, but also externally, to the vast network outside the body. In other words, the Internet of Bodies, and that comes up time and again in these military futures documents. And once again, although the National Science and Technology Council looks and sounds like a civilian science endeavour, It involved DoD, NASA, and intelligence community representatives. And why is this so important, this NSTC thing? Well, it's not just some peripheral science body. The National Science and Technology Council is a cabinet-level advisory group to the President. And this particular NBIC initiative, according to NATO, was formalised specifically with DoD encouragement. So what brave new technologies were of interest to the DoD? Essentially the same as NASA. And the DoD gave the example of embedded bionic chips in soldiers, which is interesting because in 2011 at another talk, NASA Langley said that brain chips had already been implanted in 10,000 people by 2011. 10,000. So as NASA said, this is no pixie dust. So as some examples of the oceans of individual futures papers that have been published since 2000 in the military domain, here's one called Cyborg Soldier 2050 on human-machine fusion and the future of the DoD. And it outlined 4 categories of cyborg technology which it deemed would be technically feasible by 2050 or before, covering the whole body, but it particularly focused on cyborg brains, both in terms of brain enhancement, including enhanced killing in military parlance, and brain networking, for instance, through direct data exchanges between neurons and microelectronic systems. And that kind of thing comes up time and again, as we'll see. And the paper advocated a national effort to sustain US dominance in cyborg technologies, which is significant because the paper was co-authored and sponsored by the Office of the Undersecretary of Defence for Research and Engineering, which represents the 3rd highest DoD official, second only to the Director and the Deputy Director. So what this means is that as of 2019, the 3rd highest DoD official, or the office of that official, was focused on creating cyborgs. And a 2021 paper made clear that just in case you're imagining a superhero super soldier, as in the previous image, that a cyborg warrior is not an individual superhero super soldier. It involves networked brains which together are integrated with AI. In other words, a militarized hive mind, which gets back to that network-centric warfare concept that David covered. And here's a selection of papers with various projected timeframes and details about cyborg brains. I won't go through all of this. You can access the presentation materials if you're interested in reading more. A couple of things are worth highlighting. So for instance, in 2009, NATO said that some of these technologies can be interpreted as enabling remote control of humans. Remote control of humans. To me, that's significant. And also in 2009, an Air Force paper said that adoption of some of the technologies it described may be compulsory. To me, that's also significant. There's genetic modification of brain cells. And here we have the Air Force in partnership with Microsoft on novel brain-computer interfaces. What could possibly go wrong? And the Air Force again on injectable nanotechnologies to control and record the brain neuron by neuron. And we have the DoD on nanoparticle brain electrodes that can be controlled through an external force. And I know at this point it's very tempting to go into overload and switch off, but please stay with me. So back to that 2050 cyborg soldier paper. Here's the DoD on the cyborg brains. How the use of integrated technologies will affect existing brain architectures and functions is not yet known, and arguably can only be known by implementing the particular interventions. In other words, through human experimentation. And in fact, that attitude towards human experimentation was written into the role of the Secretary for Research and Engineering, the Undersecretary, In a report advising on the new role when it was created in 2017, it said that the Undersecretary should take risks, press the technology envelope, test and experiment, and have the latitude to fail as appropriate. But we mustn't forget that it's human brains, human lives, and human beings who pay the price for those risks, all in the name of creating cyborgs, which is probably not what most service members signed up for. Okay, but that's just the military. Super soldiers and cyborg warriors are one thing. The civilian sphere is different, surely. Or is it? So here's a document called Leadership in the Era of the Human Singularity. New Demands, New Skills, New Response, from 2008. And this document says that societies, not just the military, but societies from 2030 will be stratified along transhumanist lines into 3 classes. One of those classes this document calls the tweaked, who are people with technology integrated into their bodies, which would be the mainstream of, quote, enhancement. Another class this document calls the freaked, believe it or not, which are new creations, cyborgs, clones, robots with animal or human brains, human-animal hybrids, and or networked group minds, much like the networked cyborg brains in the military intelligence domain. And third, unadulterated human beings. And the document says that the first waves of the tweaked and the freaked are likely to emerge from military research labs, which is already happening. Remember those 10,000 brain chips implanted in 10,000 people. And it says that over time, although initially humans will work with the tweaked and the freaked, they'll eventually yield leadership to the tweaked and the freaked. As pre-singularity humans, we need to discard the assumption that we will always exert control or leadership over technology. At no other time in human history has the locus of leadership shifted from the strictly human to beings with greater mental capacity than our own. That's quite a statement. So here's a little mini quiz. See what you think. Was this document published by A, a service member experimenting with psychotropic drugs, B, NASA, C, DARPA, or D, an international consortium under the oversight of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, along with a raft of US and international military intelligence bodies, the UN, and Lockheed Martin, among others? And the answer is D, a group called Proteus, which is no longer in existence as far as I can tell, involving around 30 military intelligence bodies across 11 nations in conjunction with numerous universities, the UN, as I said, and the private sector, all under the auspices of the ODNI, which feeds its advice directly into the White House and the US intelligence community via the Director of National Intelligence. So a rather high-level organisation. And its aim, as you can see, is quite a mouthful, but it reads to me as a public-private military intelligence partnership to shape global governance. And Proteus said of its cyborg societies, "The singularity will change our ideas of humanness. With the singularity, humanity will be heading into uncharted territory, raising the spectre that human beings will be rendered obsolete." And it's not just Proteus. The military intelligence cyborg soldier documents are peppered with civilian futures, along with policy recommendations, in which human-machine hybrids are cast as serving not only national security purposes, but also commercial interests. And the themes throughout are consistent with Proteus, including that technology will change our species, with humans falling to the bottom of the social hierarchy. In some documents, it even talks about humans being persecuted and forming an underclass. And another common theme is that governments and the private sector should lead in the whole endeavour and maximise this trajectory. And one document even says, irrespective of what ethicists and the public would like. Well, sure, but those are just recommendations. That doesn't mean that governments are doing anything about it, except that they are. So here's a list of some trans administration examples from the Clinton to Biden administrations. Some of these I've mentioned already, and it's worth pointing out that under the Trump administration, that Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, the one focused on creating cyborgs and taking risks and experimenting, was created under Trump as part of the 2017 National Defense Authorization Act. And more recently, the Biden administration launched a bioeconomy to invest in technologies, including those that can write circuitry for cells and program biology like software for computers. So quite a conceptual step towards seeing humans as machines, which is itself potentially a conceptual step towards seeing them as human contaminated machines. And the Undersecretary said, the same one created under Trump, said of Biden's executive order, this will advance and synchronise our efforts across the DoD and across the federal government. So while Republicans and Democrats duke it out on the electoral stage, behind the scenes, the baton goes back and forth, on the road to technocracy and transhumanism. Well, yes, but those are just policy positions. Where's the tangible R&D? And this is where the body of evidence becomes truly gargantuan. We could hold back-to-back symposia trying to cover it. Here's Proteus on research and development. The singularity is not simply a conceit devised by scientists, inventors, and futurists unduly entranced with technology. It is rather supported by a continuous stream of scientific advances that already can do a raft of relevant things. So here are just some spanning the years. The first two are sort of microbiological nuts and bolts kinds of research, and then the second two, or the last two, in vivo sort of proof of concept research. So the first one is a 2-year grant by the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, spanning 2 years and over 100 research projects around the world to 100 different technologies. There are many of these grants. I mean, they're not all this large, but there are many grants from the Air Force and the Navy and the Army. So this one was on the combining of biomolecules with synthetic nanostructures, particularly metal or semiconductor nanoparticles. And one of the technologies involved nanoantennae that controlled the activity of DNA under an external force. And interestingly, the final report was co-authored with Pfizer, which is noteworthy because about a decade later, as we'll come to, Pfizer collaborated on nanorobots with antennae that could be controlled under an external force, injectable nanoantennae, robots with nanoantennae. And then the next one is a couple of grants on cyborg cell technologies. Once again, molecular nanoscale circuits that control cells via external radiation, relevant to the Internet of Bodies, as we'll come to. And then 2 in vivo studies, one was in 2018 and a paper published in 2021, described injection, the author said like the flu shot, or the researcher said like the flu shot, of magnetoelectric nanoparticles which were successfully magnetically guided to a specific brain region where they stimulated and controlled brain cells. And in the 2021 paper said that this had the potential to enable a whole new level of precision in brain control. Then in 2018, a group demonstrated that sensors with antennae could be injected and transmit wirelessly from deep tissue locations up to 38 meters outside the body. Well, yes, but those are just for medical purposes, I hear some say. Once again, and here's the DoD, this time from 1996. If the DoD is to develop and sustain superior material, we must rely on the same industrial base that builds commercial products. The Defence Science and Technology Program will utilise technology that is the base for both military and commercial products and applications, which is the definition of dual-use technology, which is technology with both military and civilian uses. So one example is nanorobots, which are of interest in precision medicine, such that searching the term on Google Scholar yields over 23,000 results. So they're not uncommon. But they're also weapons, which can self-replicate using materials found in the environment and autonomously search out and destroy targets. And how are these threats regulated? Well, according to this book, a leading strategy is to foster collective scientific ignorance among the general population. Collective scientific ignorance among the general population, which may be why 80 to 90% of science and technology research is classified, according to that Harvard historian of science. All of which is, of course, predicated on the assumption that only citizens pose a dual-use threat and therefore must be kept in the dark, while those in power can be relied upon to rule with a benevolent hand. And just a cursory understanding of power dynamics will tell you that this is a recipe for disaster. Oh, well, yes, but nobody would weaponize medical technology, surely. Well, if we understand transhumanism as a war on humanity, here are some battle plans for medical research. NATO says that the major stimulus is restorative medicine. The DoD says that development of cyborg technologies will be driven by commercial medical applications. And NATO says that a hybridized human system is underway, mostly through pairing information technology and health nanotechnologies. You're not insane. So here are some artists' renditions of figures from journal articles for technologies ostensibly of interest in the medical and lifestyle domains. The one in the centre is a fairly typical scheme which proliferate in electrical engineering literatures about the Internet of Bodies, which has an intra-body internal network composed of nanonodes, nanorouters, etc., which interface with an external gateway, which is typically a phone or a tablet. And that finding of injected nanosensors that could transmit up to 38 meters is significant because that's far enough to reach most people's cell phones most of the time, which has been one of the challenges for this technology. And the other two are from a 2015, or renditions of figures in a 2015, seminal 2015 paper on the Internet of Bio-Nano Things, which David talked about. And as he said, the purpose of the Internet of Bio-Nano Things is to enable that intra-body network and also to turn the human body's cells and tissues into bio-cyber interfaces, including the brain, and including, as you'll see on the left, a synthetic cell with a nanotransmitter inside, where a nucleus would ordinarily be. And once again, it's not pixie dust. You can find a diagram of an intracellular antenna on the MIT website called Cell Rover. And just to finish up before we turn to COVID-19, here is the military on the role of injections in military transhumanism. We have DARPA talking about transducers injected into the body to create brain-cyber interfaces. On the cyborg warrior concept, the military hive mind, that's based on injectable, ingestible, or intranasal nanotechnology. And once again, NATO saying that an augmented or even hybrid human will be injected with amplifying nanotechnologies. And in 2021, the UK MOD said that novel vaccination processes underway at the time could be considered examples of human augmentation. So on to COVID-19 as a supporting psychological operation for transhumanism specifically. And in terms of social engineering and societal infrastructure, I refer you to David's book, COVID-19 Psychological Operations and the War for Technocracy. He covers that amply there. I'll just add two things here. One is that the government responses to COVID weren't just coordinated by military intelligence bodies in the US, but in Australia also. And virtually no one, least of all the Australian public, is aware of that. So if you'd like to access these slides, you can read more. And another little known fact is that Proteus entered the scene in the year 2000, the same year as that brave new bio-nano era at the White House and DoD, with a book called Insights from 2020. And that book contained various future scenarios focused on 2020, one of which was a viral dystopia. And that viral dystopia was characterized by asymptomatic transmission, which drove border closures and saw the rise of authoritarianism, the revocation of freedoms and rights, health passes, and the WHO rising to become a new global power. So perhaps it's a coincidence that life imitated Proteus, as well as NASA's bio-nano era in 2020, or perhaps it's not. A curious mind can't help but wonder. And perhaps it's a coincidence that Proteus is interested in both viral dystopias and cyborg societies, or perhaps it's not. So onto the question of whether the COVID era facilitated the deployment of transhumanist technologies, which is the more contentious claim. Here's Professor Ian Akiildes, who's the pioneer of the Internet of Bio-Nano Things, at an Advanced Technology Symposium in 2023 on the requisite bio-nanoscale machines. The bio-nanoscale machines are for injecting into the body, and that is going really well with these COVID vaccines. It's going that direction. These mRNAs are nothing other than small-scale, nanoscale machines. They are programmed and they are injected. So in that context, and in context of information presented today, is it really wise to keep ignoring the findings of microscopists who've looked at COVID-19 injections, including with sophisticated equipment such as scanning electron microscopes and spectroscopy, and who have found an array of undeclared structures and components in the injections, including carbon-based structures, some with metals embedded, silicon, various metal aggregates. And those that like to dismiss the microscopy as nothing but salt and cholesterol typically fail to engage with these findings, which we summarise in part 4 of our transhumanism series, because it's quite difficult to maintain the salt and cholesterol refrain in the face of this evidence on composition. So what they do instead is focus on the morphology or appearance of optical microscopy while ignoring findings about behaviour, which includes responsiveness to EMF. So the structure on the left, for instance, or ones like it, failed to form inside a Faraday bag. And on the right, we have a COVID injection on the top after 32 days in a culture dish, and then underneath after just 1 hour of exposure to a wireless charger. And this study has come under enormous fire and attack, but nobody has offered any precedent or explanation for cholesterol responding like that to wireless radiation, let alone that dramatically and that rapidly. So in this context, is it wise to also ignore findings of Bluetooth signals emanating from COVID-injected and swabbed individuals, but not uninjected and unswabbed individuals? As bizarre as that sounded at the time, but not so bizarre in the context of information presented today. And here are more microscopy images. The one on the top right also, or ones like it, also showed responsiveness to EMF. And underneath is an artist's impression of a screenshot from a TEDx talk about injectable nanorobots, 1,000 billion of them in a single syringe, each with their own antenna and IP address, able to be controlled by a smartphone or a joystick. And I'm not saying that that's precisely necessarily what the microscopists are seeing. That's just one of numerous classes of candidate technologies that, under a true science paradigm, would be considered in terms of any interpretations along with more traditional explanations such as salt and cholesterol. And interestingly, the creator of these injectable nanobots cooperated with Pfizer on the project, and he said in 2013 that he hoped that anywhere between a year and 5 years from now we'll be able to use this in humans and finally witness the emergence of a nanobot society. So those of you up the right-hand end of this continuum, you're not insane. And if experts with lots of credentials try to tell you that you are, don't take it on, because they are just as susceptible to motivated cognition as anyone, if not more so, because experts have pets. And I know this firsthand. I'm not above this. None of us are. But some experts, particularly often very senior and accomplished ones, like to think that their pet can explain everything. And if they find themselves in uncharted waters where it can't, we know where their emotions lead their cognition, fleeing in the opposite direction. So in terms of resistance, I mean, this again could be the topic of another entire symposium. What I'll just say here is hang on to your humanity, like humanity depends upon it, because if a post-human state is a viable proposition, it could be humanity's last stand. And as part of that, if you learned anything of value today, please do your best to share it with someone you know.
Lissa, thank you so much for that outstanding presentation. One of the things you know, if you've had the opportunity to work with Lissa and David and Daniel, is the extraordinary scholarship and research that has gone into these presentations and the decades of evidence and analysis by Patrick. So you're getting the synthesis of an extraordinary effort by an extraordinary group of people. And I can't help but note, since I've followed with great interest all the money disappearing from the Department of Defense since fiscal 1998, we now have over $20 trillion as of 2015, when they took the books dark in the federal government, but certainly at the Department of Defense. I can't help thinking as I watch these incredible presentations, this cost a lot of money, and in fact, the money has been disappearing and spent in a very dark way. And that's important because for those of us who are taxpayers, that promises an avenue where we potentially can stop financing this, both with our taxes and our pension funds, as our pension funds are buying much of the debt that has gone into this extraordinary investment into a central control grid. So now let's turn to our final presentation. And remember, hold on, get your questions in the live stream, because we are going to be having a panel of all the presenters after our next presentation, Daniel Brody, and this will get us into our vision of humanity. Are we sovereign individuals with rights of liberty and the pursuit of happiness by our divine creator, or are we livestock to be managed in this central technocratic control grid? So let's turn to our final presentation with the wonderful Daniel Brody, and for that I will ask my producer Logan House to introduce Daniel.
Thank you. Daniel Brody is professor of rhetoric and applied linguistics in the Graduate School of Intercultural Communication at Okinawa Christian University and a former imagery analyst with the U.S. Army. He will be presenting on the convergence of data and flesh, the financialization of transformation of the human herd. And here it is.
Greetings from Japan.
Financialization.
The title of my talk is The Convergence of Data and Flesh, the Financialization and Transformation of the Human quote-unquote herd. In September 2005, during John Roberts' confirmation hearing to the Supreme Court, Senator Joe Biden offered to Roberts an interesting glimpse of the future when a judge, quote, will be faced with consequential decisions in the 21st century, unquote. Namely, can a microscopic tag be implanted in a person's body to track his every movement? Biden carries on, his tone emotive and marked with urgency. There is actual discussion about that. You will rule on that, mark my words, before your tenure is over. Can brain scans be used to determine whether a person is inclined toward criminality or violent behavior? You will rule on that, unquote. Of course, it does help when you're in a position of power to make predictions like these and enforce the official definitions of key words and concepts, such as weapons of mass destruction. Now, for those not blinded at that time by stories of mayhem and carnage coming out of Fallujah in Iraq, Judge Roberts' confirmation hearing seemed to illustrate how elites simply assume as self-evident that the technologies, policies, and executive orders they concoct and push onto populations are necessarily ethical and acceptable. With the public